Then never come back, sign the divorce papers, and leave.
My husband hurled these harsh words at me when I said I wanted to return to my parents' home. I gladly signed the divorce papers, and the divorce was finalized on the same day. That's how desperate I was to get away from my husband. After submitting the divorce papers, I reunited with my father at my parents' house. I told him about what led to my divorce. Without showing any anger, my father calmly listened to my story. Then he made a phone call and stood up, saying,
"Let's go."
I followed, standing up and getting into the car, together with my father, to retaliate against my ex-husband. My name is Elizabeth Turner. I'm a 51-year-old stay-at-home mom. I met my husband, George, in college and got married to him. He has been very successful and is working at a trading company, and he's about to become a senior executive. My marriage with him was never smooth sailing. Well, maybe for him it was, but for me, it was like living in hell because of the pain I had to endure every day. My husband was two-faced. He put on a great character around people. Everyone around us praised him as the ideal husband, and he was lauded every day. So much that probably nobody would have believed his true nature. That's to be expected. No one would think that a man with such a respectable title would be abusive. Even before getting married, I didn't notice it. How can I expect an outsider to see through it? My husband was actually a self-centered person, and his true nature started to show only after we got married. When we were dating, he was very gentle and patiently taught me things, even when I was incompetent. He was such a considerate person. But after we got married, he completely changed. Knowing I couldn't easily leave since we got married, he started treating me as if I were his possession.
"Hey, what's with that bland food?"
I'm sorry. I did try it before serving it to you, but..."
"No excuses."
Every day was like this. I'd express a small opinion, and my husband would scream and intimidate me with loud noises. After a while, I became afraid to even voice my opinion to him. As long as I didn't resist, I'd be okay. And that's what I kept telling myself, and now I'm completely under his thumb. I used to have friends, and even tried to reach out for their advice once, but he somehow picked up on that and cut off my communication with them. He intervened and managed to effectively cut off my SOS by reaching out to my friends himself.
"There's no one else who'd take care of a screw-up like you. You just need to listen to me."
I ended up forced into a life in this prison called home. Any action I tried to take was immediately stopped. I couldn't even seek help from my neighbors, let alone my friends. Every time I tried to act, I was met with,
"Do you think this is okay? Who do you think you owe your life to? If you think you can live without me, I'd love to hear how."
But I had no comeback to that. Just as my husband said, I had no one to rely on. My mother was no longer alive, and while my father was, he wasn't the kind of person I could easily rely on. To be precise, I didn't even know where my father was. When I was young, he left me and my mother. I had no financial means to live on my own and no one to rely on. At some point, I started to believe that I might not ever be able to get out of here. I came to believe it. But then, there came a breaking point. My husband took out his frustration on me after losing gambling. The sheer absurdity of it pushed me to my limit, and I decided to convey my desire to return to my mother's home, which she left for me. "Please, it's only for a little while. I want to go back home. I want to pay respects at my mom's grave." The truth was, I wanted to get away from my husband for a bit, but there was no way I could say that honestly. Not that I didn't want to pay my respects to my mother, but more than anything, I wanted to get out of this house. That was my sole intention.
"No way. Why would you show your face to someone who's already gone? They aren't even there. Stop this occult-like thinking. There's no need to go back."
Without even looking at me, my husband continued to read the financial newspaper. I was at a loss for words at his demeanor. It was as if he didn't even consider me human anymore. I began to doubt if it was even possible to continue living with this man. Then, it was as if something inside of me snapped. Understood. When I responded coldly to my husband's words, it seemed to rub him the wrong way. He furrowed his eyebrows and shifted his gaze from the newspaper to me.
What's up with that tone? You really think you can talk to me like that?
I don't care. I no longer consider you as human.
What did you say?
Even if something happens to me because of this man, it doesn't matter anymore. If I could go to my mother, that would be enough. Maybe I had prepared myself to end everything inside me. That's why I was able to stand my ground against my husband, staring him down without backing off. Inside, I was terrified. It was my first act of defiance in a long time. It was inevitable that I would be afraid of someone whose actions were unpredictable. But I won't lose. I absolutely won't let myself be controlled by my husband anymore. I will be going back to my hometown. I didn't avert my eyes from my husband's glare, but looked straight into his eyes. I tried to act bravely so he wouldn't notice how scared I was. My husband was furious. He slammed down the financial newspaper on the table, went to the shelf with his work materials, and pulled out a piece of paper.
Then don't ever come back. Sign the divorce papers and leave.
In his anger, he shouted profanities and thrust the divorce papers at me. Probably he thought I'd panic. There was no way I would react like that. On the contrary, I was ecstatic. Inside, I was so overjoyed I felt like dancing for joy. However, I couldn't let him know that. It was the scene I'd been waiting for all these years. Now, I could finally be free. Maintaining my poker face, I simply replied, "Understood." Then, upon receiving the divorce papers, I promptly signed them and demanded his signature as well. Seeing this, he seemed taken aback, apparently shaken by the unexpected turn of events. I suppose he thought I'd cling to him and beg for his mercy once he presented the divorce papers. But that wasn't going to happen. I've waited for this moment for a long time. There's no way I'd regret this decision now. And so our married life came to an end, and our divorce was finalized within that day. I returned to my maiden name, Elizabeth Brookfield. Immediately after our divorce was confirmed, I hopped on a plane back to my hometown. My childhood home, which had become rather dilapidated since my mother's death, was dusty and in a state unsuitable for living. Getting this place cleaned up today seems like a tall order. As I sighed heavily in front of the house, I heard the thud of something heavy falling from behind.
Are you alive?
Turning around at the unexpected exclamation, I saw an elderly gentleman in a gray suit standing there. The man seemed familiar, and I began to sift through my memory. Before I could pin it down, the elderly man hugged me tightly, weeping and saying how much he'd wanted to see me.
I'm so glad. When I heard the news of your death, I couldn't sit still. I finally found you. I've been wanting to see you. I'm truly sorry that I wasn't there for you then.
The old man kept crying and apologizing, mistakenly thinking I was someone else. The strength in his arms as he held me was intense, as if he were trying to confirm my existence. And the warmth of his embrace brought back memories of my childhood. Could it be? Dad? He must have been taken aback by my words. The old man jerked in response, slowly moving away from me. Then, letting tears streak down his face, he stared intently at me.
Could it be? Are you Elizabeth?
The old man murmured while scrutinizing my face and body as if confirming. I couldn't remember his voice or face, but the feeling and scent of his embrace. Instinctively, I realized that he was my biological father, Matthew. I knew it, Dad. I've always wanted to meet you. The moment I realized he was my real father, I hugged my long-lost father again. I had no idea where he was. All I remembered was his name. My mother had staunchly refused to tell me his last name, making it impossible to find any clue about my father.
Elizabeth, I'm glad you're doing well.
Realizing I wasn't his wife, my father was momentarily taken aback, but then he quickly accepted me and hugged me back. I'm hanging in there. I'm relieved to see you're well too, Dad.
I'm sorry I left you and your mother, and I.
During the war, my father had eloped with my mother and raised me. Despite having managed to escape to a place in rural America where nobody knew us, as the heir to a wealthy family, my grandparents couldn't just let my father go. It seemed that before I was old enough to understand, they took him back home. Mom always cared about you, you know.
Huh?
When I was a child, I asked my mother once, Mom, don't you resent Dad? Why would I? Because he left you behind, didn't he? It's sad that he just left you behind and went somewhere else. As I puffed out my cheeks and spoke, my mother stroked my head gently and smiled. Elizabeth, I'm not alone. Huh? Your father left you behind, didn't he? It's not his fault. If there's anything to resent, it might be this generation. Looking out at the garden from the porch, my mother smiled a somewhat sad smile. If it weren't for these times, we might have still been together. That's what I think. So, Elizabeth, if I have the chance to meet your father again in the next life, I want to be with him, as a proper married couple this time. Her smile, as she said this, was somewhat shy. I was deeply moved, even as a child, realizing that my mother truly loved my father from the bottom of her heart, and that she still thinks of him unchanged. When I told my father, he broke down right there, crying and rubbing his face on the ground.
I too want to see you again.
Dad. Until my father had his fill of crying, all I did was rub his back. Dad, who cried until his tears and voice dried up, finally raised his head and smiled with swollen eyes.
I'm sorry, showing such a pathetic side of me when we were reunited after so long.
No, don't worry about it.
If you're here and Mom hasn't shown herself, she must have passed away before us.
My father, who had regained his composure, speculated about my mother from the situation and muttered as if he had realized something. I nodded slightly at his words and led my father to the family altar, and we decided to pay our respects to my mother after a long time. It's been a long time, but we've finally come to see you. I'm back. As I clasped my hands together in front of the altar and whispered in my heart, I felt like my mother was smiling and welcoming me back. I had that kind of feeling. As I shared my recent life updates to my father, he noticed the ring on my left ring finger.
By the way, did you get married?
The ring, a symbol of my love with my ex-husband that I'd completely forgotten about, felt like handcuffs to me now. I felt a sense of disgust for the ring, and as I removed it in front of my father, I answered his question. I was, but I just got divorced.
Divorce? Did something happen?
I was really torn whether to be honest with my father, who looked worried. There's no guarantee that he would believe me. He might even take my ex-husband's side and tell me to stop the divorce and try again. As my anxiety spiraled in me, my father seemed to sense it. He placed his hand on my head and gently stroked me as if to dispel my unease.
I want to protect you, to make up for not being able to do anything for your mom. I might be a helpless father, but will you talk to me? I'm on your side.
The warmth and kind words of my father naturally brought tears to my cheeks. I don't ever remember receiving such kind words during my marriage life. It's okay to rely on someone. Feeling as though my mother was also urging me on, I decided to tell my father everything about the mistreatment I had received from my ex-husband. After I finished my story, my father stayed silent for a while, not attempting to respond. Should I have kept it to myself after all? I regretted my decision and was filled with anxiety. As he watched me, my father abruptly stood up, seemingly deep in thought.
Elizabeth, follow me.
Huh? Where are we going?
Just come.
But, without further explanation, my father instructed me to follow him, and we both got into a waiting car. I had no idea where we were headed, but while I was pondering this, my father was on the phone with someone.
Hey there, it's been a while. I've got something to discuss about your son. We're on our way back home now. Could you come over? I appreciate it.
It appeared he had invited someone over to the house, but who could it be? My question was soon answered.
It's been a while, Mr. Patterson. You look well, Mr. Bennett, and it's been quite some time, hasn't it, Elizabeth?
Father-in-law, is that you? The unexpected visitor to my father's house was my ex-father-in-law. Why on earth was he here? Did he and my father know each other? As I stood there puzzled, my father chuckled awkwardly.
I'm sorry. Hearing your story made me a little irate, and I failed to explain the situation properly. Actually, Mr. Bennett and I are drinking buddies. We met through mutual friends. I knew he had a daughter, but I had no idea that it was you, Elizabeth. What a surprise!
My ex-father-in-law burst into hearty laughter, a stark contrast to my father, the gentleman. Who would have thought that these two very different men could be such good friends? Who could have imagined such a turn of events? As I stood there dumbfounded watching them chat merrily, my father coughed lightly to get my attention.
The reason I called Mr. Patterson here is that we need to discuss his son, your ex-husband. Something about George. What happened? Did something happen between him and you, Elizabeth?
He probably hadn't been informed about the situation. My father-in-law's eyes sparkled as he gazed at me with curiosity. Honestly, both my father-in-law and mother-in-law were wonderful people, and it pained me to tell them we were getting divorced. But, with the support of my father and late mother, I steeled myself to convey everything. My father-in-law quietly listened until I had finished, but the moment I stopped talking, anger seeped into his expression.
Did our son really do such a thing?
His powerful presence, as he questioned me, was so formidable that I almost stepped back, but I shook my head vigorously. Hearing that, my father-in-law shot a glance at my father, seeking confirmation. Once my father slowly nodded, my father-in-law's face turned bright red.
Why didn't you come to us earlier?
He raised his voice in anger. The pain in my chest at seeing his reaction made me think that he didn't believe me, and I froze when I heard his words. Go to them earlier? Thinking I might have misheard, I cautiously turned my gaze back to my father-in-law. His face was a mixture of anger and guilt, and he seemed genuinely concerned for me.
Did you think we were unreliable? Did you think we would favor my son?
I was genuinely taken aback by what my father-in-law said. Was he really trusting me, an outsider, over his own son? Everyone is supposed to love their own children the most, so why? I must have worn my confusion on my face. My father-in-law, looking downcast, spoke to me in a soothing tone.
Ever since you, Elizabeth, came into our family, we've treated you like a daughter. You know we'll never favor our son over you. You should rely on us more.
He placed his hand on my shoulder, offering a gentle look. At that moment, I realized they were truly listening to me, and tears began to flow. Tears of relief and guilt filled me. I should have told them earlier. I should have asked for help. I shouldn't have tried to give up. I need to communicate my feelings to others. After I had calmed down, I expressed my gratitude to my father-in-law. Watching all this, my father patted my back, and my father-in-law continued to speak comforting words, acknowledging my ordeal. Feeling relieved, I regained my composure and once again expressed my gratitude to my father-in-law. My father-in-law chuckled shyly, saying,
"Oh, stop now. Stop it now."
and the three of us were enveloped in a warm atmosphere.
"Well then, shall we drop a bombshell on that idiot son of mine?"
A bombshell?
"Yeah. George did something horrible to you, Elizabeth. We need to make sure he apologizes properly. I won't be satisfied until he does."
And so, we were faced with the prospect of confronting my ex-husband. However, I did not want any more direct contact with my ex-husband. I didn't even want to make a phone call. Seeing this, my father seemed to have an idea, and he asked my father-in-law to connect him on a call.
"I'll summon him here. I'm Elizabeth's father. I can't just sit by and do nothing while my daughter's going through this."
Stay calm. I plan on speaking to him with composure. As if he could read my mind, my father reassured me with a gentle smile.
"Mr. Patterson, could you please connect me with George?"
Hearing this, my father-in-law immediately called my ex-husband and handed the call over to my father.
"Hello. Nice to meet you. Elizabeth has always spoken highly of you."
My ex-husband probably suspected something when a stranger suddenly took over the call. From the other end of the phone, a skeptical voice seemingly picking a fight could be heard saying,
"Who the hell are you? We need to talk about Elizabeth. I want you to come to my house right away." "Huh? Why should I go all the way to a stranger's house?"
We could hear his loud voice, though the call wasn't even put on speaker. I wonder how loudly he was talking into his phone. What a way to talk to someone he's meeting for the first time. I felt disgusted by my ex-husband's rudeness.
"Just come. You got that?"
I was a little surprised. My father, who usually speaks in a gentle tone, was unusually stern and angry. My ex-husband must have sensed this. I could tell from his hesitant intake of breath over the phone. After saying just that, my father abruptly cut the call and returned the phone to my father-in-law. A while later, my phone began to ring incessantly.
"You don't have to answer that. We're going to meet him anyway. Just ignore it."
Following my father's instructions, I obediently switched off my phone. I probably didn't have the courage to call back anyway. He would confront me head-on, since I am an easy target. That's the way my ex-husband would do it. It was obvious what he was thinking, and it was pitiful enough to make me sigh in exasperation. After a while, my ex-husband arrived at my father's house. My father-in-law must have given him the location. As soon as he arrived in his car, he barged into the house and started complaining.
"What the hell is going on? Summoning me here? And who the hell was that old man on the phone?"
My ex-husband yelled as soon as he entered. Despite his loud voice making me wince, he didn't seem to care. He spotted me and started yelling again.
"Elizabeth, why aren't you picking up my calls? I've been calling so much, and you just cut me off. You think you could do that to me?"
In front of my furious ex-husband, my father stepped forward, shielding me.
"What's your problem, old man? Get out of the way. You're annoying." "I won't move. You should stop talking to Elizabeth like that." "What? It's none of your business. Stop butting into family issues."
My ex-husband responded with an annoyed click of his tongue. His attitude brought back traumatic memories, and my body trembled in fear. I hugged my arms tightly to hide my fear, but my father-in-law kindly reassured me with a hand on my back. Thanks to him, I regained some composure and looked at my father, who stood unflinchingly against my ex-husband's fury.
"Nice to meet you. I'm Elizabeth's father." "What? Her father? I thought Elizabeth didn't have a father."
Instead of being surprised at my father's statement, my ex-husband looked at him suspiciously. Since I never talked about my father, he must have assumed he was no longer around. His presumptuous attitude made my anger rise.
"I assure you, I am indeed her father. If you want, I can get a copy of her birth certificate. It will confirm immediately that Elizabeth is my daughter." "No need. So what's up with that call? Saying I need to apologize to Elizabeth. What am I supposed to apologize for?
My father, undaunted and standing firm in front of my ex-husband, was so manly. I felt a reassuring strength in my father's back.
What's with the pompous attitude you've been carrying around? Isn't there something you should be telling me?
Seeing my ex-husband's behavior, my father-in-law is livid. With his brows furrowed, he sends a fierce glare towards my ex-husband, speaking in a stern voice. The aura radiating from the towering giant is intimidating, making me feel nervous even though I'm not the one being scolded.
Is there something I need to say?
Upon this, my ex-husband completely recoils, backpedaling like a frog being stared down by a snake.
What have you been doing to Elizabeth up until now? What? I didn't do anything in particular. I was just taking care of naive Elizabeth. Don't you dare lie.
The ex-husband, as it turns out, really can't handle being scolded. It's probably hard for someone like him who thinks he's superior to be lectured by others. Upon hearing my ex-husband's unbelievable response, my father-in-law raises his voice, coming down on him like a thunderbolt that sends him flying into the wall.
Hi. Naive, huh? It's you who doesn't understand anything about the real world, kid. How dare you act all high and mighty to others? Have some shame.
My father-in-law starts yelling at my ex-husband, releasing all the frustration I had been bottling up. Scared, my ex-husband steps back, stumbling over the sofa behind him, and collapses into a sitting position.
Listen here. The reason you've been able to act so important in my company is all thanks to whom, you think?
Truth is, my ex-husband is employed at my father-in-law's company. My father-in-law built the company from scratch, and my ex-husband had been working there as a potential successor.
The amount of work you do is minuscule. Something any other employee could easily handle. You also have a life with Elizabeth. I only favored you because I thought if you didn't advance in your career, it would increase Elizabeth's burden.
Hearing this truth from my father-in-law, I turned my surprised gaze towards my ex-husband. He had been boasting to me all this time that the company can't function without me. Turns out that wasn't quite the case. I married such a pitiful man. I felt my ex-husband becoming smaller and smaller.
Perhaps it was a mistake to keep an inflated ego like you in the company.
Dad, what do you mean?
I'm firing you. What?
Certainly, I was astounded by the shocking statement, and so was my ex-husband. I thought it was an unrealistic proposal to suddenly talk about firing him, but...
We have proof that you embezzled the company's money, George. I was planning to discuss this with Elizabeth, and now this. I'm done turning a blind eye to your foolish antics.
One after another, George's misdeeds were being revealed. Even I, normally composed, was taken aback, looking at George with incredulous eyes.
Wait a minute. I admit I screwed up, Dad, and Elizabeth too. I was an idiot, not appreciating what you've done for me. I was stubborn, and that was my mistake.
It seems he finally understood the situation. George clung to me in tears, pleading pathetically for forgiveness. Looking down on him, I managed to maintain a polite smile. Could you refrain from addressing me so casually, please? My cold tone, unlike anything he had heard from me before, must have shocked him. He froze, merely looking up at me in surprise. You and I are done. Please don't call me so intimately. Ideally, I'd rather you didn't touch me at all.
Elizabeth, what the hell are you talking about?
He couldn't believe the resistance I was showing. This was the first time I, who had lived in fear of my ex-husband, had reacted this way. He seemed as shocked as if he'd been bitten by his own dog. It was comical. I couldn't help but let out a chuckle. Oh, did you not hear me? Should I repeat myself then? Bending down to my ex-husband, who had collapsed in a heap, I whispered coolly into his ear. Just seeing your face makes my skin crawl. Please disappear from my sight. With that one statement, I poured out all the grievances I had endured, and then I left my ex-husband's side. What followed happened in the blink of an eye. He was taken away by my father-in-law, a shell of a man, and even after returning home, he was constantly grilled. Both my father and I were astounded at George, who was experiencing a worse hell than the marriage life I endured. He truly got what he deserved. Thus, I exacted my revenge on my ex-husband and successfully cut him off. I hired a lawyer to fight for a hefty alimony in court after the divorce. I had been documenting all the emotional abuse I had endured, and handed over the diary and the recordings I had made just in case. My ex-husband offered to resolve things by talking to me directly, but I firmly refused. I never wanted to see his face again. With the help of my lawyer, I ensured that I wouldn't have to meet him. Then, I was informed that it was almost certain that I would win the case. I felt relieved and decided to fully enjoy the rest of my life. My father-in-law fired my ex-husband on charges of embezzlement and cut off all ties with him. My ex-husband cried and begged, but he was turned away at the door. They didn't even bat an eye at him. After that, I decided to live with my father. Through my father, I kept in touch with my father-in-law and others, and we are now closer than when we were married. At first, I was hesitant about living with my father. I thought it might be strange for me, an adult, to depend on my father. But then my father offered me some comforting words.
If you're okay with it, how about we spend the rest of our lives together in your mother's house?
With those words, my father and I embarked on many trips to make up for the time we couldn't spend together as a family. We traveled not only within the states, but also abroad. We wandered all over the country. I wanted to show my late mother, who loved to travel, various beautiful sights. So we always carried a photo of her on our trips.